In a poem written in 1829, a visitor to New Orleans, Colonel James R. Creasy, recorded his impressions. Have you ever been in New Orleans? If not, you'd better go. It's a nation of a queer place, day and night a show. He continues by listing many of the different types of characters he claims to have found in the city, from Negroes in fine purple linen to robbers, pirates, alligators, assassins, gamblers, drunkards, and cotton speculators, sailors, soldiers, pretty girls, and ugly fortune tellers. Like so many 19th century visitors to the city then, Creasy was deeply fascinated by its diversity. What's more, like many others, his descriptions of what he calls a constant show ascribe a theatrical element to New Orleans itself. It was not only visitors who made such connections, and locals too drew on theatrical metaphors when they sought to describe the city. Writing in her diary in 1859, the day after she attended a performance at the brand new French Opera House, born and bred New Orleans local Clarissa Pierce Canas described the vibrant streets as like a living parterre. While for Creasy then, the city's occupants reminded him of the dramatis personae of a theatrical work, Canas's link was between the character of the city and the theatre audience. By the middle of the 19th century, New Orleans had a thriving and well-established theatrical life in both French and English. At the heart of the French Quarter, in both geographical and metaphorical terms, sat the francophone Théâtre d'Orléans. And here we've got a picture, and then here, just to show you how very central it was in the city for quite a long time. This theatre was the crowning glory of cultural life in the city from its opening in 1819 until it was replaced by a new French opera house in 1859. For some 35 years, the theatre was home to the first and only permanent opera company in North America, with a troupe recruited annually from Europe. It was not the only theatre worthy of public attention in the city, though. From 1824, James Caldwell's American Theatre on Camp Street provided audiences with spoken and musical productions in English. The citizens of New Orleans, then, were never short of theatrical entertainment, and much of their regular fare was opera. While neither Creasy nor Canas's characterizations of the link between city and theatre were unique to New Orleans, of course, and Creasy's account in particular draws on familiar tropes of 19th century travel writing in its description of foreign locales, I nevertheless want to unpack them further in order to explore connections between the theatres and questions of identity in 19th century New Orleans. In particular, I want to suggest that these theatres and their productions of French operatic works became a means through which locals and visitors alike could both present and understand the city in all its diversity. To do so, I'll first outline some of the ways in which the local press used the Théâtre d'Orléans and its productions of French grand opera to explore highly charged issues in local society, in order to argue that these operatic performances became vehicles for the negotiation of local, national and international identity for diverse groups of New Orleans' population in the 1830s. Then, I'll turn to a novel written by a French visitor to New Orleans in order to show how the theatre itself became a lens through which European visitors could view intercultural contact and difference in the mid-19th century. So, the arrival of French grand opera in the mid-1830s was extremely important in New Orleans' theatrical life in several respects. First, it marked a major change in the theatre's repertoire. Until then, it had consisted almost exclusively of older opera comique and vaudeville. And yeah, this slide just shows some of the older repertoire. Never before the arrival of grand opera had the theatre attempted operatic works of such a scale. The grand opera captured the public's hearts quickly and in enduring ways. Meyerbeer's operas, for example, were performed many hundreds of times in the city across the 19th century. In many cases, New Orleans was able to produce works very quickly after their Parisian premieres. Meyerbeer's Le Prophète, for example, was performed in New Orleans on the 2nd of April 1850, just under a year after it was first heard at the Paris Opera, and before it reached operatic centres such as Brussels, Berlin or Budapest, not to mention New York. And all of this was made possible through intricate and extensive networks of transatlantic contacts created by the Théâtre d'Orléans management. Meyerbeer himself was integral to this process on various occasions, arranging for the release of his scores and for auditions with suitable prima donnas, as well as allowing the Théâtre d'Orléans director to go on stage at the Paris Opera to view the workings of Le Prophète up close in 1849. For the people of New Orleans, however, grand opera's significance extended far beyond both popularity and luxury, since the genre and its performance there became entwined with important political issues. By the time Grand Opera reached New Orleans, social tensions between the city's French and English-speaking communities were boiling over. French hegemony was under severe threat. The stream of Anglophone American settlers that had started to arrive following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had become a torrent, and Francophone citizens were now not only outnumbered, but were also beginning to lose their grip on the city's thriving commercial life. In time, the cultural sphere too fell under threat. Since 1824, Coldwell's American Theatre, for example, had been competing directly with the Théâtre d'Orléans for audiences and then for cultural dominance. Tensions reached a head in the spring of 1835 when, as the Théâtre d'Orléans prepared to stage Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable, the city's Francophone residents were horrified to discover that Coldwell's theatre was about to beat them to it, in an incident that has passed into the mythology of opera in the city, and has been touched on by Catherine Jones, Sarah Hibbert, and others. Robert premiered in English at the Camp Street Theatre on the 30th of March 1835, finally reaching the stage of the Théâtre d'Orléans 6 weeks later, on the 12th of May. The French, so most accounts conclude, were shaken by this challenge posed by the Americans to their cultural supremacy, but took comfort that the Théâtre d'Orléans' production was of a higher quality. The reception of Robert, and also of Les Huguenots, which was the next grand opera to be heard in the city in April 1839, can give us a remarkable insight into the way in which the theatre became the site of the negotiation of conflict between the local Francophone and Anglophone communities, whilst also playing a role in the projection of the cosmopolitan ambitions of both groups on an international level. While the French language reception of Robert in New Orleans has been explored by Henry Kmen, in actual fact the English language reviews were far more numerous, and it's these that I want to look at here. The English language critics focused primarily on the version of Robert that had reached New Orleans. By 1835, the work had already embarked on an illustrious European career in all manner of different forms, as has been explored by Christina Furman, among others, and it had been heard as a melodrama in New York. Most notable about these New Orleans English language reviews was the fact that they revealed a novel style of emerging work-oriented criticism, in a move away from the then prevalent approach of the city's critics, which had typically focused on individual performers and performances. The critic for the bilingual Courier, for example, proudly explained that Thomas Reynoldson, the Englishman who directed the American theatre's production, had been able to procure a copy of the original score on loan from Philadelphia. Such a lineage, then, validated the American theatre's production as authentic, in a stark contrast with its usual reputation, which was for often rearranging works completely, unlike the Théâtre d'Orléans, which prided itself on performing works in their original form. These critics were, therefore, particularly proud to note that Reynoldson had not on this occasion drastically rearranged Meyerbeer's score, but had, and I quote, merely curtailed the parts of those instruments which he has not under command in his own orchestra. In their eyes, this might have been Meyerbeer with holes, but it really was Meyerbeer, and that mattered. Such authenticity, of course, was very much a relative concept, and we know, for instance, that on several occasions the American theatre inserted minstrel shows between the acts of Robert. But authenticity of this sort was extremely important for the critics' perception of the theatre's local and international standing. That's to say, on a local level, such authenticity positioned the American theatre as the equal of the Théâtre d'Orléans, while on an international level, it allowed critics to imagine their theatre in relation to Paris. Indeed, the writer for the Courier stated that when Robert was acted at the Patent Theatres of London, only the melody performed was original, but took pains to point out that at the American Theatre in New Orleans, the original music as a whole, for the first time, was presented outside of Paris. In such a light, questions of authenticity extended beyond the composer and his score to matters of place, as the concept of originality here became firmly linked with Paris. This was a particularly significant move for the English language critics, given that London was their usual touchstone of theatrical excellence, and their phrasing here suggests that they believed that the American theatre's production had actually bypassed London in that all-important matter of authenticity. Instead, it was directly comparable with Paris itself, the operatic capital of the 19th century. In drawing this link, such a review's significance was twofold. On the one hand, the critic posed a direct challenge to the local Francophone community, which had long-standing cultural ties to Paris. But on the other, the review indicates that Anglo-Americans felt at home enough in New Orleans now to imagine the city's international position as their own, even if the way in which they were able to do that was through grand opera, a borrowing from French culture. In the discourse surrounding Robert, the appropriated Grand Opera became the representative of Anglo-American aspirations to cosmopolitanism. The Francophone reviewers, apparently stunned by both the American theatre's performance of Robert and the Anglophone critics' intense engagement with it, lapsed into uncharacteristic near silence. While one Francophone critic gave a short but damning review of the American theatre's production, another reprimanded him, stating that the production hadn't in fact been bad at all and that credit should be given where it was due. But it wasn't long before the French critics too, used Grand Opera in the city as a means of conveying their cosmopolitan ambitions. When Les Huguenots premiered in April 1839, critical attention came almost exclusively from the French language press. Emulating many of the responses given by Parisian critics to the work's French premiere 3 years earlier, they tapped into a vein of international critical rhetoric, which focused on the complexity of the score and the necessity of repeated attentive listening, which, as Cormac Newark has pointed out, emerged in Meyerbeer reception as a means of signalling a great work. By couching their responses to Les Huguenots in the terms of such international operatic discourse, the New Orleans critics asserted through their very language that New Orleans was at once capable of mounting productions of international repute, and also of understanding them within the critical frameworks developing in Europe. In the debates surrounding Grand Opera, therefore, critics projected many of the city's most pressing debates onto the theatre. It became a locus around which people from opposing factions of New Orleans' population could form a variety of interlocking local and international identities. If the city's theatres were vehicles through which locals could explore pressing socio-political questions relating to their identity, the importance, both cultural and geographical, of the French theatre in city life equally seems to have played an integral role in the experiences of visitors to New Orleans. Scenes in numerous 19th-century French travel accounts reveal that the theatre was not only an important way of encapsulating New Orleans for a European readership, a kind of shorthand for local society at large, but also became a means through which French authors, the French authors of these accounts, could engage in processes of cultural self-reflection. While these accounts take a huge variety of forms, some of the most fascinating sources in this respect are works that are predominantly fictional. I want to focus here on the role of the Théâtre d'Orléans in a novel called L'amour du nègre, which was published in Paris in 1860. Its author was Charles Joubert, a Frenchman who had spent 6 years in Louisiana from 1834 to 1840. And it's particularly fascinating to note here that despite his later literary career as a novelist and feuilletonist, during his time in Louisiana, he was actually the principal bassoonist in the Théâtre d'Orléans orchestra. So L'amour du nègre follows a young Parisian named Roger, who goes to New Orleans in 1834 to settle his late father's estate. The novel tells the story of a disastrous love affair, which results in Roger's transformation from a wealthy heir to a hunted and broken man. At the very heart of the novel, there's a lengthy scene that's set in the Théâtre d'Orléans, where, during a performance of Auber's one-act opera comique Le Concert à la Cour, Roger's fortunes take a sudden and dramatic turn for the worse. Roger's gone to the theatre at the instigation of his pretty horrible new fiancée. She wants him to report back on the evening's events because she can't be bothered to go herself. Mademoiselle Dupuis, a young soprano, and Madame Sinclair, the established prima donna, both of whom, incidentally, were real-life contemporaries of Joubert's, though the events of the evening are completely fictional. They've been vying for position for weeks, earning passionate partisans within the theatre audience, and this night is expected to be the moment of reckoning. So not long after the start of the performance, a fight breaks out between the rival supporters, and the ensuing melee is nothing if not operatic. So everyone's on their feet in the orchestra, the parterre, in the boxes. They exchange insults, threats. The actress, cause of all this noise, takes the opportunity to faint on stage. Blows, bellows, fists rain down on all sides. A dagger is drawn, and in an instant, 20, 50, 100, 200 daggers, knives, dart sticks, pistols shine in the room. The rioting mob spills out onto the street, where 2 people are killed, many injured, and dozens more arrange duels to settle personal scores. Roger and his companions are confronted by a young man named Simpson, Roger's bitter love rival. In the midst of the chaos, Simpson challenges Roger to a duel with pistols, and when they meet the following day, Roger kills him and is forced to flee New Orleans, his fortunes and his reputation in tatters. So what might we make of such a overly dramatic scene and of opera's role within it? Throughout most of the novel, Joby's taken care to paint an image of New Orleans as exotic. He introduces the unfamiliar side of city life through the eyes of Roger's bumbling Parisian uncle, Monsieur Potard, who is totally unable and unwilling to cope with the climate, the customs of his black landlady, or the local cuisine. He is, in a sense, a satire of the European abroad, and provides a perfect foil to his more open-minded nephew. Nonetheless, characterizations of New Orleans as exotic would have been familiar to Joby's Parisian readers. Parisian journals of the period, for example, printed articles on the city that focused on everything from the dangerous wildlife to unfamiliar burial customs. This is just one of the articles. But Joby's presentation of the theatre complicates this picture. In contrast with the more straightforwardly foreign outside world, the experience of opera-going is characterised in the novel by its recognisability for a Parisian reader. Roger is listening to an opera comique by Auber. The performers' egos are as inflated and fragile as those of any Parisian prima donna, and they have the same power to inspire partisan support. Even the audience oddly reminds Roger of what he's left behind in France, in spite of a strong surface degree of difference from Parisian custom in the social makeup. So, arriving at the theatre early, Roger observes the rapidly filling auditorium, the parterre packed with white men, the Louisiana Belle in Parisian dresses in the first tier, the second tier occupied by free people of colour, and the third tier filled with slaves. But while he watches the slaves, dressed in white dresses, yellow or red tignons, and eating their pecans, figs and oranges, all Roger can do is muse on how like the titi of the Parisian boulevard they are, sat up there in New Orleans' equivalent of the Paradis. He sits there musing on this quite nostalgically for a few minutes. For Roger, the initial experience of opera-going in a foreign locale turns out to be oddly familiar, even uncannily, perhaps almost satirically Parisian in its more colourful aspects. For one brief moment before the performance begins and chaos breaks out, the 5,000 miles between New Orleans and Paris appear to momentarily collapse as Roger sits in the theatre and thinks of home. In these terms, then, it's tempting to read Joby's Théâtre d'Orléans as a reassuring symbol of civilization and a reminder of home in an otherwise exotic locale. However, Roger is soon confronted with the fact that image and reality often diverge, and that the opera performance serves as a catalyst for climactic social disintegration. Indeed, the scene reflects aspects of the city's divided urban politics sketched out in the first part of this paper, as it sees the culmination of rising tensions between Roger, a visiting Frenchman, and Simpson, whose name strongly suggests that he's Anglo-American, leading ultimately to the duel and Simpson's death. But even if the events at the opera in Joby's novel go some way towards undermining any image of cosmopolitan civilization, and the multitude of knives, daggers and dartsticks might appear to verge even on savagery, in some respects, the riot precipitated by the performance might have struck Parisian readers as uncannily familiar. On the one hand, the episode is simply a typical piece of novelistic drama, an overblown take on the trope of the soirée à l'opéra, of which Cormac Newark has explored. But on the other, it hints at well-known stories from close to home concerning incidents both on and off the operatic stage. Descriptions of the scene's almost theatrical violence would surely have brought to mind the onstage revolutions of grand opera, while the notion of such a fracas taking place within the opera house might well have called to mind the fabled incident in which a performance of Auber's La Muette de Portici in Brussels was said to have provoked a riot that culminated in the Belgian Revolution of 1830. Here we go, rioting scenes in the opera house. The scene at the opera, therefore, seems to become the means through which an exotic society at large is translated into a recognisable form, to borrow James Duncan and Derek Gregory's terms for a common process in travel writing. But the result is not a straightforward domestication of the exotic elements of New Orleans. The scene becomes a concise and powerful way of bringing the local environs of a faraway place and the familiar European experience of opera going together, presenting Parisian readers with an uncanny experience. Exotic and other as the outside world might be, the interior of the theatre, including its sudden explosion into violence, would have remained perhaps uncomfortably recognisable, forcing Parisian readers to confront elements of themselves within that other. Doubtless such a scene would have generated a frisson of excitement, but it also created an opportunity for more serious reflection upon the nature of intercultural contact and difference in the period. There are a number of other ways, not opera-focused, in which this then goes on to happen in the later stages of the novel, but I don't really have time to go into them here. But it serves to say that the scene at the opera really begins this whole process of cultural confrontation in the novel. So to finish things off then, while Keynes's characterization of the city as like the parterre of the theatre then might simply have been a passing comment, the relationship between theatre and city was significant and complex in 19th century New Orleans. The Théâtre d'Orléans and its productions of opera in particular, as we've seen, were fundamentally linked with issues of identity for locals and visitors alike. In both cases, transatlantic connections, both real and imagined, played a fundamental part in this relationship. In the case of the locals and their debates over grand opera, not only had the production of grand opera in New Orleans been enabled by intricate webs of transatlantic connections, which I've not really had time to go into here, but they'd also relied on a series of imagined connections between New Orleans, London and Paris, which allowed them to position their city in international contexts. In the case of Jobé, the uncanny similarities between the opera-going experience in New Orleans and Paris invited self-reflection for Parisian readers as much as they revealed new perspectives on New Orleans. As such, a focus on the manifold ways in which 19th century writers negotiated the relationship between opera, the opera house, and the city reveals much about the ways in which residents of New Orleans and Parisians alike sought to assert themselves culturally in an increasingly interconnected world.